everyone. Today I'm going to be doing a lecture about Washington Irving. So, this man, American author, from 1783 until 1859, although he wasn't writing as a baby, that's just when he was born. So I will be using some abbreviations in this lecture, such as YOA, referring to years of age or how old they were, AR, not referring to assault rifle, but the American Revolution, RVW, referring to Rip Van Winkle, PG, period, referring to a page number, pretty common one to use, grammar and syntax, GNS, italics, usually I use it for a citation or a work of literature or just a business name. And then bold, I usually use for names or definitions. The underlying portions in this slideshow, which I will have a separate video of because the quality on the TV is not going to look the same. The underlying portions are going to be pretty important. So if you are taking notes, be sure to pay special attention to those sections. So it's important to learn a little bit about the author before you dive into their works because you want to know their inspiration, you want to know the setting, the culture of the time, and he, in fact, was born the week that British made the announcement of ceasefire, which ended the American Revolution, which is very important. He was raised when the country was just being started. So, his name came from George Washington. He was named by his mother, Sarah. His family came from Europe and lived in Manhattan. When he was 6 years old, that's when he met the person who had his same name, George Washington, and George Washington gave his blessing to Irving at his inauguration. He was uninterested with school. He often ditched class when he was about 14 years old in order to attend theater, which plays more a role in his social life later on, but that does have an impact on his literary style as well because of the people he surrounds himself with. So, about a year later, when he was 15, that's when some yellow fever broke out. And so his parents decided to take a logical course and send him to live with a friend. This friend was Kirk Paulding. He was an Anglophobe. And for those of you who don't know, an Anglophobe, not unpopular at the time, basically people who hate British people. He was also a satirical writer and paired up with Irving later on in his writing career. When he moved to live with his friend Paulding, he moved to Tarrytown, which is a real place in New York by Sleepy Hollow, and that gave his inspiration for the very famous story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. When he was about 19, that's when his writing career really started. He was sending letters to the Morning Chronicle. They were social commentaries, some political stuff as well, including some of his Federalist ideology, which got special attention from Aaron Burr. You might recognize that name from history class. But it was very significant because Aaron Burr was one of the editors, or at least the publisher, of the paper. So he got some favor, and Aaron Burr started to push his works out a little more, which helped his writing career. He almost never wrote under his real name. The first pseudonym that we have is Jonathan Oldstyle. Charles Brockton Brown, kind of a funny name. You could shorten it to Charlie Brown if you want to be a little cheeky about it. He tried to recruit Irving for a Philadelphia magazine, which Irving declined at the time, but he took on later on, as you'll see in a future slide. He also took the Grand Tour, as urged by his brothers. Now, for those of you who don't know what the Grand Tour is, that's basically just a trip that people would take to Europe for some cultural enrichment. He didn't really want that, though. He wanted to work on his social life. So he worked on his sociability and eventually became a well-known and popular guest for a lot of gatherings. In his early 20s, he studied law, and he even admitted that he barely passed the bar examination when he was about 23 years old. When he was about 25, unfortunately for him, his fiancée, Matilda Hoffman, passed away. He tried again a little later in life, and by a little later, I mean when he was 40 years old. Tried to get with an 18-year-old named Emily in Dresden, Germany. It didn't work out so well for him, and I don't blame her for rejecting him after some of his questionable writing about women. He was even a minister to Spain in 1842, and he had a lot of political involvement as well in his life, but we'll get to that later. So, continuing with his writing career, he joined a group he called the Lads of Kilkenny. And this, I have a nice little image right here. You're not going to see, my hand's probably cropped off right now. But the Salmagundi was a magazine that many compared to Mad Magazine at the time. But it also went under the name, which is, not as popular of a name because it's way too long. The Whims and Opinions of Lancelot Langstaff, Esquire, and others. So, naturally, people just refer to it as the Salmagundi. It was satirical, which is, where people draw that similarity between it and Mad Magazine. He worked on it with his oldest brother, William, as well as Paulding, which was the artist we mentioned earlier that he lived with when there was that yellow fever outbreak. So, he did have a good impact on his writing career. Irving also referred to New York City in this magazine as Gotham. So he's the one who coined that term, and yes, that is the same name that they use for the Batman universe. But Gotham means Goat's Town, for those of you who didn't know. Pretty interesting name. He wrote a history of New York from the beginning of the world to the end of the Dutch dynasty. Very long name. But the importance of this work is that it was the first appearance of Diedrich Knickerbocker, which was another pseudonym he took. I know some of you may recognize the name Knickerbocker. It was a very culturally significant name, a house name at the time. And it has been used for all sorts of naming conventions in New York, whether it's a road or even the name of a team. So he later on worked as an editor for the Analectic magazine for about 2 years as its editor. And the Analectic was known for publishing biographies and French translations of different medium, and as well as some British selections that they pulled over. And they even wrote some of their own reviews. Now, when Irving worked there, he wrote some naval biographies, for some sailors. But the main importance with working at the Analectic magazine for his later writing career was that his very last work was, in fact, a biography, and we'll get to that a little bit later. In 1817, at the ripe age of 34, he went completely bankrupt. He was at a strap for cash, and that's when he ran into Walter Scott, who was a historian and a playwright. Now, they probably became besties talking about theater, as Irving had that as one of his passions. And then in Birmingham, England, he got some inspiration to write one of his most famous works, Rip Van Winkle. Now, he wrote it then, when he was in Birmingham, mostly because he was homesick. He missed Manhattan. But he did not publish it quite yet. He was also given the chance to be a United States Naval Chief Clerk, but he turned that down to pursue his writing career. In 1819, he requested his brother Ebenezer to publish some of the things that he sent him, including Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, the two most renowned works of Washington Irving. And he published it in a collection that's just typically referred to as the Sketchbook, although the entire name is the Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon Gent. His works became very popular, but unfortunately they didn't really have any copyright laws at the time, so what ended up happening was people began republishing his work without his permission. So, in order to kind of circumvent that and make more profit off of his works, instead of having them just being stolen, he published them both in Europe and in America. And this is where Walter Scott comes back in. It's very important that he made friends with him because that's how he was able to get some help to publish some of his stuff in London. Unfortunately, his brother William passed away, and Irving kind of hit writer's block. He needed some inspiration, so he started to travel around Europe to get some of that. And then he wrote Bracebridge Hall, or The Humorist, a medley, in 1822, which people say is loosely inspired by Aston Hall, and that's where the Bracebridge comes from, because that's where the Bracebridge family lived at the time. Then he went to Paris and did a collab with John Howard Payne, who was an actor and playwright. Once again, theatrical friends. And then 2 years later, he wrote The Tales of a Traveler in 1824, which included another somewhat well-known work of his, The Devil and Tom Walker, which, for those of you who don't know, was inspired by the German folklore story of Faust. For those of you who don't know, it was basically a man who sold his soul to the devil in order to get something out of it, because he was convinced that if you're going to sin, you may as well sin it up. Then he left for Madrid about 2 years later in 1826, and he wrote the history of the life and voyages of Christopher Columbus in 1828. Now, this was the very first work that he published under his own name, not using a pseudonym like Diedrich Knickerbocker or Jonathan Oldstyle. And that was very significant in his life for his writing career. And he got some attention from the Duke of Gore in Spain. And the Duke of Gore decided that his work was worthy enough to give him access to a library that had a lot of medieval records, which was very important for the inspiration of later works, such as the Chronicles of the Conquest of Granada in 1829, just a year later, and Voyages and Discoveries of the Companions of Columbus in 1831, 2 years later. Now, works about Columbus, the way that Irving wrote, would later become a genre known as Romantic history, which is essentially when you take a historical event and you kind of just add a little bit. You embellish the story in order to either make it more interesting or to change the point of view of the reader. And it was popularized by Walter Scott. So once again, Walter Scott did have a pretty big impact on his writing career. Now, in about 1830, he served under Minister Lewis McLean as a confidential secretary. He helped negotiate some trade between the U.S. and the British West Indies. And he was awarded that same year by the Royal Society of Literature and given an honorary doctorate in civil law in 1831, just a year later. He served as a secretary to the Treasury in 1831 until he was then replaced by Van Buren, who was appointed by Andrew Jackson. So, like I mentioned earlier, yes, he was very politically involved, not only in England, but also in America. In 1832, a year later, he wrote Tales of the Alhambra, which was inspired from his time that he spent in Granada, which I do believe I had a picture on the previous slide. Then he returned to the United States to check out some Native American settlements. Now, he took this tour with, who was he? Henry Leavitt Ellsworth, who was the man who commissioned the tour. And he also tagged along with Charles La Trobe and Count Albert Alexandre de Portales. Now, forgive me if my pronunciation is a little off, but the importance is he took a tour to look at some Native American settlements, which inspired his work, A Tour on the Prairies, in 1832. Now, all of a sudden, he gets talked to by John Jacob Astor, who is a wealthy fur merchant. And Astor asks him to write the history around fur trade. So that's why he wrote Astoria, or Enterprise Beyond the Rocky Mountains in 1836. This was a pretty significant text, along with a tour on the prairies, and another one later on to kind of cement the idea that he was an American author, not just European involved. And just a little fun fact, I guess, here. Irving, Astor, and a couple others founded the St. Nicholas Society. So you may or may not have heard of it, but they founded it. Now, in around 1837, that's when he met up with Benjamin Bonneville, who sold him some maps and some notes from his misadventures in the West, and sold it to him for about $1,000. And that gave him some material to work with, right? So that's where he wrote The Adventures of Captain Bonneville, which obviously named after the guy who gave him the material. Now, his Western-based works, such as The Adventures of Captain Bonneville, The Prairie, he wrote those in response to critics who criticized him of being too European and not American enough. So that's what cemented his idea there. And yeah, I mean, they had a somewhat legitimate reason to criticize him for that, because he did spend almost 20 years in Europe. Then he moved back to Tarrytown and bought a decrepit old cottage, which later he named in 1841 Sunnyside, which I have a little illustration right here. Not illustration, just picture. But that's what it looks like today. Not as decrepit, obviously. But because of how worn down it was, he wasn't really able to keep up with the expenses of upkeep. So it kind of forced his hand to contribute to the Knickerbocker magazine, which is a little bit ironic because it was named after him. Anyway, he was sought after by some other authors, a very notable one, Edgar Allan Poe, who came to him asking for some advice when he was writing The Fall of the House of Usher, a very important work that will be covered later in American literature. As I mentioned before, Irving had a bad run-in with copyright law, and while it was in legislation for Congress, he was advocating for it. He openly advocated for it in the Knickerbocker magazine, but unfortunately, at the time, it did not go through. Just a couple fun things here. An honorary academician for National Academy of Design in 1841. I think at this point they were just throwing awards at him left and right. And in 1855 he wrote The Wolfert's Roost, and 9 years prior he wrote, or rather revised, his previous works in order to get some pay from George Palmer Putnam, and published it for him. And the very last thing that he wrote in 1855 to 1859 was a collection of works about the biography of George Washington. It was the very last thing that he wrote. 8 months after its completion, he died of a heart attack. So, talk about getting it done right before the deadline.